Chapter 13. In chapter 12, William had to fix the windmill. He had to fix the fans because sometimes the roof of his house would fall in and he was worried about creating a fire. As you know, live electricity that goes through the wire, when it touches things, for example, like the grass that they use to make the roof, it would set the whole house on fire. So he had to create things that would stop this from happening. Then he realized his windmill was going to break if the wind was too strong. So he had to get up there and fix it by himself, and eventually he manages to fix it by using a kind of belt, something that you wrap around the chain just to make sure that it doesn't fly off and that it's dangerous. And now we're on to chapter 13, the Restless Inventor. Restless means that he doesn't relax. Inventor is someone that creates things. That January, the students returned to school at Cachcolo. I sat on the road one morning listening to them laugh and joke and talk about their friends and teachers, and when they had passed, I went to my room and closed the door. I still saw Gilbert and the others for games of bawu, and when they said things like, "So William, when shall we see you at school again?" or boasted about their grades, I said nothing, or simply told them I'd rather not talk about it. And after a while, no one did. It was around then I started noticing the ghosts. Not real ghosts, but boys who had dropped out of school and now loitered and hung around in the trading center without purpose, with nothing to do. I'd see them outside the dry goods store in their bare feet and grimy clothes, so their broken, disgusting old clothes, waiting for small jobs so that they could spend all night in the bar rooms. In Malawi, we say these people are grooving through life, just living off ganyu with no plans for the future. Ganyu is when you pick up like a small job and get a little bit of money. I started worrying that soon I'd become like them. I worried that one day the windmill would no longer excite me, or it would become too difficult to maintain and fix, and the mice rows or boozing dens would slowly swallow me up. It was easy to lose hold of your dreams. I battled this darkness by trying to keep a positive mindset, thinking positive. Every week I returned to the library just to continue learning and stay inspired. I read all the novels and spelling books and practiced my English. And I continued checking out, explaining physics, using energy and integrated science, and researching other ways to help my family. Because the windmill had been such a success, I was feeling pressure to do something bigger. I began to see myself like a famous reggae pop star who had just released a #1 album and now had to produce another hit. The fans were waiting, at least I thought they were. So each day at the library, I flipped through my books looking for the next big idea. Many people who came to see my windmill kept saying the same thing. "This looks like an antenna." Or, "If you can make this electric wind, you can make one of those. That's what it looks like anyway." This made me curious how an antenna actually worked, and after thinking about it for a while, I went to Joffrey with the idea. "Hey, these people are always saying our windmill is an antenna, so let's give them what they want." "What do you mean?" "Let's build a radio station." That afternoon, we looked through our bags of parts and found 2 junker radios that didn't even have covers attached. A radio is what you put on to listen to music or listen to the news. I wanted to test a theory. Excuse me. One night a few weeks before, there had been a thunderstorm. I was in my room listening to the Sunday Top 20 songs when a huge crack of lightning exploded and caused a blip on my program, as if the lightning had sliced through my signal. So taking the 2 radios, I tuned one to a static frequency, then took the second and turned it into the same place on the dial. When this happened, the second radio went silent. No static, nothing. Static is the... Was the frequency from one radio penetrating, disturbing the other, just like the lightning bolt? If that was true, surely I could put my own voice on top of that frequency and let it ride into the next radio. One of the radios I was using was a Walkman with both AM and FM and a cassette player. So leaving the first radio tuned to static means that it doesn't connect to a radio station. It just keeps this sound. Shh. I took the Walkman and switched it to the tape mode. I noticed that wires ran from the tape head to the speakers, so I unhooked and reconnected them to the player's condenser, which controls the frequency. Perhaps music meant for the speakers could instead catch a ride on a frequency wave straight into its fellow radio. I put my Black Missionaries tape in the deck. Here it goes, I said. I pressed play, and sure enough, the music played loud and clear in the other radio. The Walkman was my transmitter, meaning that if I had 5 radios tuned to the same frequency, they would all play the Black Missionaries. Now, Mr. Joffrey, I said, how can I do this with my voice? I unhooked the wires from the condenser and reconnected them to a separate speaker, which I had broken off of some headphones, turning it into a microphone. I pressed play again and started talking into the mic. 1, 2, 1, 2, I said. I could hear my voice coming from the other player, the other radio. Good afternoon, Malawi. This is your host, William Kakwamba, along with my trusty sidekick, Mr. Joffrey. Your regular scheduled program has been interrupted. So he's kind of like hacking into the radios. After that, Joffrey and I began experimenting with our little radio station. Joffrey walked outside with the radio, while I stayed in my room and started singing his favorite Billy Kawanda songs. Even outside, Joffrey could hear my voice clearly. I held nothing back. After a while, he shouted, "My ears are bleeding, but please carry on, this is cool." But the farther he got from my bedroom, the weaker the signal was. After 300 feet, it completely disappeared, which was probably good for Joffrey on account of my terrible, lousy voice. If only we had an amplifier, we could broadcast to greater distances, I said. But Joffrey was scared we would be arrested for messing with the government's frequencies. People kept saying the same nonsense about my windmill. Hey, you better be careful or ESCOM will come and arrest you. If the first people to experiment with great inventions such as radios, generators, or airplanes had been afraid of being arrested, we would never be enjoying those things now. Let them come arrest me, I told them. It would be an honor. Soon I was attacking every idea with its own experiment. Over the course of the next year, I was constantly planning or devising some new schemes for creating different things. And while the windmill and radio station had been successful, I could not say the same for other adventures. The project I was most excited about was a water pump, which had been part of my original idea that day in the library. Just as I had done with my windmill, I first designed an experimental pump so I could play around with the idea, with the concept. I modeled it after a picture in Explaining Physics of a standard force pump, which uses a piston and a series of valves to push water through an outlet. Basically, pumping water is just moving water using air. The best example was the hand pumps my mother and sister used in Wimby to get our water. My goal was to build a pump over the shallow well at our house. It was nothing but a 40-foot hole where we took water for washing clothes and floors. It wasn't clean water to drink. The only way to get the water was by using a long rope and a bucket. To pump water, I would need a pipe and one that was long enough to reach the bottom of the well. So the well is like a huge hole in the ground where water is kept. So for them to get the water out, they throw like a bucket down into the water and they pull it up again with a string. So William's trying to think of a way that he can create something that brings the water up without using a bucket and a rope, because that takes a long time and a lot of energy. Just a few days earlier, I had stumbled over some irrigation pipes buried in the ground at the scrapyard that I must have overlooked. Taking my hoe, I went one morning and I dug them up. He got them out of the ground. The first was a wide PVC pipe, which I used as my outer barrel. I placed it down the well until I felt I hit the bottom. The second pipe was metal and slightly thinner, perfect for my piston. Mr. Godston then welded, combined, a round metal washer at the end of the pipe and left its center hole open. So he's creating this thing where you can bring the water up. Around the washer, I attached a thick piece of a tire rubber that acted as the seal. I then had Godston bend the top of the pipe to make a handle. When the metal pipe was pushed up and down, so moving it up and down quickly, it created a kind of vacuum inside the outer PVC pipe. When you pulled up, the water was sucked into the plastic pipe, and when you pushed down, the rubber seal opened and pushed the water up to the surface, then out of a small hole into a bucket. But the problem was the rubber valve created too much friction against the plastic pipe. My mother and sisters tried using the pump along with some other women, but they found it too difficult to operate. "I can't manage this thing," my mother said. "It feels stuck." I tried greasing the pipe, but the cold water made the grease too thick and clumpy. After a while, I gave it up. The pump was a failure, but it was nothing compared to my attempt to create biogas. As I mentioned earlier, deforestation, so when they're chopping all the trees down, in Malawi has made it difficult to find firewood for cooking, and gathering wood only adds to this destructive cycle. A good harvest of maize usually gave us enough dried cobs to burn for about 4 months, but once those were finished, the hunt for wood began. In addition to fetching water in Wimby, my mother and my sister routinely walked 2 miles, like 4 kilometers, to the small blue gum forest near Kachkolo to cut down a bundle of thin trees, a chore that took at least 3 hours. This wood was still green, and burning it produced thick white smoke that poured from our kitchen windows. Looking inside, I would see my mother stirring the pot of insima, food, squeezing her eyes closed as tears ran down her cheeks. All the girls in my family developed nasty coughs each year. A cough is a In Malawi, this is every woman's burden, something difficult. And I knew these journeys to find wood would only get longer and longer. Plus, the deforestation would only create more devastating droughts and floods. So they're chopping all the trees down, but obviously the amount of trees goes down. Someone had to save our women and trees, and I thought, why not me? Ever since I had built the windmill, women asked me, "Does electric wind allow your mother to cook?" The answer was no. My windmill didn't supply enough voltage to power a hot plate, much less an electric stove or oven. But a few weeks earlier, I was experimenting with wires and batteries and struck upon an idea. I took a long piece of copper wire and wrapped it around 20 times around a thick, big piece of grass, the kind we use to build our roofs and fences. I connected both ends to a 12-volt battery and felt it heat up. Soon the wire was glowing red hot and the grass caught fire in my hands. It was a simple, kind of stupid experiment, but it really got me thinking. Maybe something like this could boil water. I couldn't place a metal pot atop a coil of wire because it would act as a conductor, meaning the metal pot would get hot. A clay pot was too heavy and would crush the coil. So I built a kind of magic wand using an empty ballpoint pen. These kinds of coils existed already. I'd seen them in the trading center, but they were powered by the Eskom electricity. Eskom is the company. I connected mine to a 12-volt battery and dipped the coil into the water. In about 5 minutes, it was boiling. So basically, with electricity, he creates something that gets really hot, and he puts that in water. After 5 minutes, the water is boiling. But this was too simple. I had to go bigger. My integrated science book had a small section on alternative fuels, such as solar, so using the sun to create electricity, or hydro, using water to create electricity, both of which I had studied. But it also mentioned something called biogas, which was made by converting animal poop into fuel to use for cooking. The book described a long process to get this gas. First, you had to bury the poop in a pit under the ground, then wait months and months before the gas could be tapped with a valve. But I couldn't be bothered. I don't need a pit, I thought, and I certainly don't need to wait that long. So I came up with and devised my own plan. I snuck into my mother's kitchen and snatched the round clay pot she used for making beans. Now all I needed was the organic matter, the poop, as the book described it, and I didn't have to look far. Across the compound, my Aunt Chrissy kept 2 goats in a wooden pen behind a house, and the ground was covered with their marble-shaped poop. Taking a sugar bag, I made sure nobody was looking and climbed over the fence. I filled the sack with poop until it was spilling over and walked back to the kitchen. My mother was busy in the garden, which gave me plenty of time to work. First, I dumped the poop into the pot and filled it halfway with water, causing the brown, grassy balls to bob and float, so floating poop in water. I then covered the top of the pot with a plastic jumbo bag, and I tied a rope around the lid, sealing it tight. For my valve, I clipped the top of the radio antenna and poked a hollow tube through the center of the plastic. Lastly, I corked the top with a reed. My mother's fire was still warm from breakfast, so I added a handful of maize cobs until the coals caught life, so under a fire. I placed the pot in the center and waited for greatness. Kamkwamba, I said to myself, you've really done it this time. In a few minutes, I heard a rumbling inside the pot as the water began to boil. The plastic puffed and danced from the steam, but the rope held tight. My heart began to shake, flutter. I'd give it a few more seconds before initiating the final test. That's when my mother came in. "What's that smell?" she shouted. I stammered, "But biogas, it's horrible. Why are you doing it in here?" I had no time to explain. By now the plastic was rumbling like mad, ready to blow. I had to act quickly. It was time to remove the reed and proceed with ignition. I reached over and uncorked the valve, and when I did, a pipe of silver gas came rushing to the top. My mother was right. It smelled terrible. It's like boiling poop. I grabbed a long piece of grass and that I set aside and poked it with the fire, catching a flame. I stood up and ran to the door, pushing my mother aside. "Stand back!" I shouted. "This could be dangerous." "What?" With half my body protected by the doorframe, I thrust the flaming torch towards the valve and shielded my eyes from the blast. But when the fire touched the gas, all it did was fizzle and die. I was left holding a wet piece of grass, dripping with poopy water. My mother was furious. She dragged me out of the kitchen, yelling, "Look at what you've done. You've ruined my best cooking pot. Boiling goat poop? Wait until I tell your father." I tried to tell her I was doing it for her sake, for her help, but I guess it wasn't the right time. In 2006, when I was 18 years old, another famine struck Malawi. That year, thanks to a change in government, my family had been able to buy a few bags of fertilizer. At first, the rains came, like they normally do. We planted our seeds and waited for them to show their faces, waited for the plants to grow, then added a spoonful of fertilizer along with a prayer. By January, the seedlings were ankle high and showing their little arms, so happy to be drinking up the delicious rain. But just about the time they reached my father's knees, the rain stopped completely. By the time dough season arrived, most of the ears were deformed, so they're growing the maize again, but it's not really growing very well. The government quickly promised help, but in the meantime, people grew angry and scared. During the famine of 2001 and 2002, the first one he talks about in the book, people blamed the corrupt officials who sold off our surplus. But this time, instead of acknowledging the weather, they blamed magic. And that meant blaming me. Superstitions were still very strong throughout the country, and several incidents in the news had stirred fears even more. So the country's in a famine, there's no rain, there's no food again, and the people are getting angry. During the previous famine, we heard lots of reports about vampires stealing people's body parts and selling them. Following the vampires, a strange beast appeared in Doha and began attacking villages. Some said it looked like a hyena. Others said it was a lion with the face of a dog. The attacks caused thousands to flee and escape their homes and sleep in a forest, where they were more vulnerable to this creature. The police conducted all-night searches. Then one evening, they managed to corner the beast in a thicket and opened fire with their guns, with their rifles. But instead of falling dead, the beast split into 3 separate animals and disappeared into the bush. Villagers summoned their Singangas, who concocted a powerful potion and threw it at the trees. Remember, Singanga are like those doctors, the witch doctors? The next morning, the beast lay dead on the road, its single corpse, its body no bigger than a dog. Later, it was discovered that the animal was the product of magic. A certain trader near Doha had purchased some thunder and lightning from a powerful witch doctor and refused to pay for it. In retaliation, the wizard sent a monster against his village. Obviously, this is what people believe, but I don't think that's what happened. These stories, however ridiculous and crazy, only increased people's fears in evil powers. So in 2006, when it looked as if another famine was coming, people blamed magic. For weeks we had gone without rain, then finally one day in March, giant storm clouds appeared in the distance. The sight of oily black thunderheads was something to celebrate. "Look," people said, "today we will have rain. Finally we are saved." But as the clouds came overhead, a strong wind began to blow. It whipped the red dirt into our eyes and mouths and sent little cyclones tearing through the fields. Little by little, the storm drifted away without leaving any rain. With nothing but the scorching sun left in the sky, people gathered at my house and pointed up to my windmill. The blades were spinning so fast the tower rocked and swayed. "Look, this giant fan has blown away the clouds. His machine is chasing away our rain." "This machine is evil." "It's not a machine, it's a witch tower. The boy is calling the witches." "Wait a second," I said. "The drought is all over the country. It's not just here, and electric wind is not the cause." "But we saw it with our own eyes," they said. I was afraid these people would return one day and tear down and destroy my windmill, or worse. All the next week I stayed inside. I even stopped the blades during the day so that they wouldn't be more suspicious, or people would think that it's the problem. At the trading center, people approached and talked to Gilbert. "You can tell us the truth," they said. "Is it true what he says about this electric wind, or is he really a witch?" "He isn't a witch, someone that does magic," Gilbert answered. "It's a windmill. It's a scientific machine. I helped him build it." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. You've seen it for yourself." Many of them had even used my windmill to charge their mobile phones. But placing the blame on me helped them overcome their fears about famine. Luckily, not after that, the government stepped in and released tons of maize on the market. A few months later, some aid agencies arrived and offered more assistance, so some people were bringing help. No one starved or died. A catastrophe, a tragic accident had been avoided, but still, it underlined and showed how kind of simple and backwards our people are, and that really frustrates me. That's the end of chapter 13. So William talking about trying to create more things to try and help his family and help his village, like something that brings water out of the ground so his sister and his mother don't have to walk for 3 hours every day to get water. And then he talks about another famine that came, and people started blaming the magic that obviously doesn't exist. That's the end of chapter